They laughed when they heard the words come out of a boy covered in mud. "I'm going to throw mud in your face." To anyone watching from the outside, it sounded like a childish threat, insolence, bad manners. To those with money, power, and control, it was just another invisible kid talking too much. But no one there realized that the phrase was not an attack. It was a warning. Because seconds later, what looked like embarrassment turned into silence. What seemed like madness turned into fear. And what seemed impossible began to unfold right in front of everyone. A billionaire father trying to pretend everything was normal. A son trapped in a wheelchair, blind with no explanation. And a barefoot boy no one would ever take seriously, until it was too late. This story is not about easy faith. It is not about cheap miracles. It is about the price of hope when everyone else has already given up. It is about adults who choose control over truth. And about a child who dared to challenge fate with something no one valued: dirt, courage, and his word. You will feel indignation, you will question decisions, you will doubt along with them. And when you think you finally understand everything, the story will turn in a way no one was prepared to see. Because the real miracle here does not begin in the eyes, it begins in the fear no one had the courage to face. Stay until the end. This is not just a story to watch. It is a story to feel. And if you enjoy stories that stir the heart, challenge logic, and prove that the impossible sometimes only needs one chance, subscribe to the channel now and follow more stories like this. Sunday dawned gently, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and simple promises. Kaio pushed the wheelchair with care, as he had done since the accident. The park was their weekly refuge, the stage of rehearsed normalcy that he smiled at. Strangers as if asking permission from fate itself. Dean kept his eyes open, unmoving, fixed on a void that gave no response. Doctors called it unexplained blindness, a phrase that never explained anything. Kaio called it waiting, a word that feels lighter when spoken in silence. Birds sang loudly, indifferent to human drama. The wind played with the leaves, brushing the boy's face. It was an ordinary Sunday, until ordinary decided to change everything. Kaio talked about small things to hold the world together. He commented on the ice cream stand, the dog running free. He described the sky as if painting an invisible canvas. He believed his voice could create images. Dean listened with an old attentiveness, like someone saving crumbs. The chair rolled softly over the pale stone path. The park seemed to conspire for calm, offering benches and shade. Kaio took deep breaths to hide the recurring fear. Fear that his son's silence might be permanent. Fear that Sunday would be just another empty rehearsal. Laughter echoed around them, whole families gathered in circles of joy. Kaio felt the contrast as a quiet not envy, but longing for what might have been. He adjusted Dean's cap, a gesture of learned care. Touch became a language when words failed. Dean smiled faintly, a smile that came and went like the tide. Hope lived in those brief moments. Moments that sustained entire weeks of waiting. Kaio believed constancy created miracles. And that was why he repeated the park ritual. The chair stopped near the lake, a trembling mirror of the sky. Kaio described the ducks as small arrows gliding on water. He spoke of sunlight reflected, unsure if it helped. Dean tilted his head, attentive to the distant sound. His world was made of noises and textures. Kaio learned how to exist within that sensory map. He learned not to cry in front of his son. He learned to smile with deliberate strength. The billionaire unlearned numbers to learn presence. Nothing seemed out of place in that script. A balloon vendor passed by, colors dancing in the wind. Kaio described each shade as if it were music. Dean reached into the air, searching for shapes. His hand returned empty, but the gesture lingered. Kaio swallowed hard, trained not to react. He knew his son's body still held memory. He knew something slept behind the fog. Science had no answers, but life insisted. The park offered a stage for that insistence. And Kaio accepted the invitation every Sunday. An elderly woman passed and wished them a tender good morning. Kaio thanked her, anchoring himself in shared kindness. The boy did not respond, but turned his face toward the sound. That small detail lit a restrained flame. Kaio noticed and smiled, without announcing the quiet miracle that he had learned to celebrate softly so as not to startle fate. The clock marked mid-morning. Enough time to believe again. Enough time to pretend normalcy with courage. Nothing signaled the script about to break. The scent of damp earth drifted from a nearby flowerbed. Kaio inhaled deeply, an old memory from childhood. He thought of bare feet, of simple games. He thought of what Dean could no longer see. Guilt hovered, an old acquaintance, polite and persistent. He pushed it away by gripping the wheelchair handles tighter. Love demanded posture, not lament. The park seemed to agree, vast and patient. The morning moved on, gentle as a promise, and Kaio kept his pace. They sat beneath the shade of a wide tree. Kaio told a short story to fill the pause that he spoke of quiet heroes who win without swords. Dean listened quietly, breathing in rhythm with his father. The world seemed to fit on that bench. The chair, the tree, the lake, the voice. Kaio believed it was enough to keep going like this. To continue until something gave way inside that he did not know what, or when. Hope does not require a calendar. Then a strange silence formed around them, not the absence of sound but a curious pause. Kaio felt it before understanding it, like a chill. The park breathed differently for a second as he squeezed his son's hand, alert. Dean lifted his chin as if sensing a presence. The ordinary Sunday trembled, almost imperceptibly. Something was approaching, still without a name, and fate, patient as ever, chose that moment. What came next would break the habit forever. The boy appeared as if sprouting from the earth itself, without warning, barefoot, feet stained with dried mud, clothes far too big for his body. Kaio noticed him out of the corner of his eye, instantly alert. Experience had taught him to protect before asking questions. The boy stopped a few steps away, his gaze steady, fearless that he did not ask for money, did not ask for attention. The words came out raw, unpracticed, almost childish. I'm going to put mud on your face. The park seemed to shrink around them. Kaio froze, his entire body on guard. Kaio's hand instinctively went to the back of the wheelchair that he positioned himself slightly in front of Dean, like a shield. The word mud sounded strange, out of place. That it was not a common threat, it was something more confusing. The boy did not raise his voice, did not make any sudden move. That he spoke as if stating a simple fact. Kaio measured the distance, calculating invisible risks. Wealth teaches you to distrust the improbable. Even more so when the improbable comes from poverty. The silence weighed more than the sentence. Dean reacted to the unfamiliar sound with sudden attention. That he turned his face toward the boy. His small body leaned slightly forward. There was no fear, no withdrawal. Curiosity appeared before shock. Kaio noticed that detail and hesitated. The dirty boy held his gaze steady. There was no challenge there, only a strange certainty that as if he knew something others did not, that unsettled more than any threat. Some people nearby slowed their pace. Curious glances began to gather. Kaio felt the anticipation of judgment in the air. The billionaire and the strange boy, an easy script for gossip. That he took a deep breath. Trying to stay calm. That he asked who the boy was, his voice controlled. The answer did not come immediately. The boy tilted his head, thoughtful. That he seemed to choose his words with unusual care. The earlier sentence still echoed. Kaio considered calling a park security guard. The thought passed quickly and disappeared. There was no aggression there, just something out of place. The boy held a small cloth bag. From its open mouth came the faint smell of damp earth. Real mud, not a metaphor. Kaio frowned, confused. Logic tried to take control, but his heart watched Dean, attentive, and Dean was different. The boy took a step forward. Kaio stiffened his shoulders. Dean raised his hand, feeling the air. The gesture dismantled half of Kaio's defenses. The phrase, mud on your face, took on another weight. That it no longer sounded like a threat. That it sounded like a poorly explained promise. The boy noticed the outstretched hand. That he smiled slightly, a shy smile. The park breathed again. Kaio asked his name. The boy opened his mouth to answer. There was a brief pause, almost solemn. That as if that introduction mattered more than usual. The cloth bag swayed in his thin hand. Dean kept his hand in the air, waiting. Kaio felt a strange knot in his chest. Something told him to leave. Something told him to listen. The ordinary Sunday had already broken. Some people whispered in the background. Others pretended not to see. The boy held Kaio's gaze without backing away. There was no challenge, only silent conviction. Conviction is often more frightening than violence. Kaio realized that too late. His son was breathing differently, more present. The wheelchair seemed smaller in that moment. The park, larger and unpredictable. The story demanded continuation. The boy finally began to speak. His voice came out calm, surprisingly steady. Before his name, something deeper emerged. An explanation no one had asked for. And yet, one everyone seemed to need to hear. Kaio felt that the first sentence had only been a door. What lay behind it was much greater. Something ancient, learned outside of books. Something that would shake everything he believed, and the boy's name was only the beginning. The boy took a deep breath before saying his name, as if stepping into a role. That he said his name was Davi, his voice low but steady. Kaio repeated the name silently, testing its sound. Davi pointed to the cloth bag with almost reverent care. That he explained that inside it was not ordinary dirt. That it was earth. But not just any earth. That he spoke of his grandmother, Mrs. Julieta, with ancient respect. A healer of forgotten people. According to him. A woman who listened to the earth as one listens to advice. Kaio frowned, attentive despite himself. Davi said his grandmother taught that the earth holds memory. Memory of the body, of fear and of pain. That some illnesses hide when fear takes command. And that the right clay calls back what has hidden itself. That he spoke without haste, choosing simple words. That he did not mention miracles or grand promises. That he spoke of care, time and listening. Kaio realized there was no fanaticism there. There was knowledge passed from hand to hand, that confused him even more. Davi described a stream in the mountains. That he said the earth there was dark and cold. That it could only be gathered at dawn. That his grandmother gave thanks before touching the ground. Kaio tried to picture that unlikely scene. A world far removed from hospitals and medical reports. A world where healing did not come in prescriptions. That he felt the urge to laugh and did not. The light in Davi's eyes stopped him. It was the light of someone who believes because he has seen. The boy said he did not charge anything. That he never charged. His grandmother had taught him that way. Those who need it do not pay, and those who can help later if they wish. Kaio swallowed hard, uncomfortable. Money had always solved everything for him. Here, it neither solved nor even began. Davi continued, without asking permission. That he said the clay does not force anything. That it only invites the body to remember. Dean listened in focused silence. The boy turned his face toward Davi. As if he could see him beyond his eyes. When Davi said the word remember, Dean reacted. His hands slowly closed. Kaio noticed the detail, his heart racing. Months without a reaction like that. Davi noticed too and smiled softly. Not in victory but in confirmation. Like someone recognizing a sign. Kaio asked why he had approached them. Davi answered without hesitation. That he said he felt something when he passed by. That Dean's silence made a different kind of noise. That the earth warms when it recognizes someone. Kaio felt an involuntary shiver. Reason tried to assert itself, but failed. Nothing there felt rehearsed. Neither request nor performance, just an encounter. Davi spoke of his grandmother with restrained longing. That he said she was no longer there. But that she had taught him everything she knew. That now he carried what he had learned, not to prove anything to anyone, but to help when he felt the call. Kaio found himself torn between disbelief and respect. That he did not want to believe, but he did not want to turn him away. His son was breathing more deeply now. That mattered more than any theory. The cloth bag was opened slightly. The smell of wet earth spread through the air. Dean inhaled deeply, almost imperceptibly. Kaio felt his eyes fill with tears. Davi closed the bag carefully. That he said he did nothing there in the park, that it required calm time. That the decision was not his to make. That it belonged to the boy and his parents. And Kaio felt the weight of that choice. Some people around them drifted away. The park returned to its normal rhythm. But nothing there was normal for Kaio. The explanation felt too simple. And precisely because of that, dangerous. Simple hope is often the cruelest. Davi waited in silence without insisting. Dean remained attentive, his body alert. The billionaire realized reason was losing ground, and the next move would not be his alone. The request came out low, almost shy, but it changed the air. Dean said he wanted to touch Davi's face. Kaio thought he had heard wrong. Months had passed without spontaneous requests. The boy barely spoke beyond what was necessary. Now his voice sounded curious, awake. Davi did not move right away. That he looked at Kaio, asking for silent permission. Kaio hesitated for a second that felt long. Then he nodded, still confused. Dean extended his hands with a new kind of care. His fingers moved through the air, searching for reference. Davi crouched down to his level. The closeness revealed a striking contrast. That hospital-clean skin against skin marked by sun. The fingers touched his face with respectful gentleness. Dean did not pull back. That he explored slowly, like someone reading a map. The silence grew dense and attentive. Kaio forgot to breathe for a moment. Dean commented on the texture of the skin. That he said he could still feel the earth there. Davi smiled, without moving. That he let the touch continue. Kaio watched every micro-reaction of his son. There was no tension, no fear. There was genuine curiosity. Something he had not seen in a long time. Doctors would call it sensory stimulation. Kaio called it a small miracle. Dean asked to hold the cloth bag. Davi handed it over without resistance. The boy squeezed the fabric between his fingers. That he inhaled deeply once more. The smell of clay seemed to anchor him. That he commented that it was cold and good. Kaio felt a tightness in his chest. That he could not remember the last time Dean had described something like that. The description was life in motion, and it unraveled him from the inside. Davi explained that the earth calms, that it helps the body feel safe. That he spoke simply, without lecturing. Dean listened with an adult attentiveness. Kaio realized an exchange was happening. That it was not about healing yet. That it was about presence and connection. Something pain had interrupted. The park seemed like a silent witness. Even the leaves seemed to listen. Dean asked if the clay tickled. Davi laughed softly and said sometimes. The laughter was contagious. Kaio laughed too without realizing it was a sound forgotten in his own throat. The moment broke the rigidity of fear. Dean relaxed his shoulders. The wheelchair felt less heavy. Nothing had objectively changed, but everything was different. Some people passed by and looked. Kaio did not care this time that he felt too whole to mind others' judgment. Davi kept a calm posture. There was no rush in his gestures as if he knew time was an ally. Dean kept touching, curious. Each second reinforced an invisible decision. Kaio felt something was being chosen there, even without words. Dean returned the bag carefully that he thanked him, his voice low and polite. Davi nodded, respectful. The gesture seemed to seal a silent agreement. Kaio realized he was no longer just a spectator, that he was part of something he did not control. Fear tried to return, but it was drowned out by the glow on his son's face. That glow was worth any risk, and that frightened him. Davi commented that Dean's body was responding well, that he spoke as an observation, not a promise. Kaio felt hope grow without asking permission, that he tried to contain it, failed. Dean seemed more present, more there. The park no longer felt like a neutral setting, that it had become a turning point. Kaio knew he needed to decide something. Pretending normalcy was no longer enough. The next obstacle would not come from outside. A familiar sound interrupted the moment. Quick footsteps, a tense voice in the distance. Kaio recognized it before seeing her. Fernanda was approaching with a closed expression. The real world came rushing back. Davi sensed the shift in the air. Dean did too. The calm they had gained wavered. Kaio felt that his son's reaction came at a cost, and the next conflict was already walking toward them. Fernanda arrived with firm steps and a suspicious look. She stopped when she saw the dirty boy so close to her son. Her body reacted before reason. Protection mixed with shame and irritation. She did not ask who he was, she asked what was going on. Her voice came out hard, cutting. Kaio tried to explain, but was interrupted. The social contrast jumped out at her, and it bothered her deeply. Fernanda pulled Dean's wheelchair closer. The gesture was automatic, almost rough. Dean shrank a little, sensing the tension. Davi stepped back, respectful. The mother looked at the cloth bag with disgust. She asked if that was dirt. Kaio said it was earth. The word softened nothing. She shook her head, incredulous that it all seemed completely absurd. Fernanda spoke of doctors, of renowned specialists, of expensive tests, of clinics abroad. She said this was not where they would find a solution. Not with an unknown boy. Shame came disguised as reason. She did not want an audience for her son's pain. She did not want improvised hope. Much less in front of strangers. The park, once welcoming, became a threat. Kaio felt the weight of division. Davi remained silent, that he did not try to explain himself, that he had learned from his grandmother that insisting breaks the effect. Fernanda interpreted the silence as guilt. She said it was irresponsible. That messing with the mind of a sick child was cruel. The word sick echoed heavily. Dean heard it and stiffened. Kaio felt the phrase like a blow. The boy did not see himself that way. Fernanda turned to Kaio with contained anger. She asked if he had lost his mind, that if money was no longer enough, now he was seeking superstition. Kaio tried to argue, but failed, that he did not fully believe either. What disarmed him was his son, his reaction, the glow, the curiosity. Fernanda did not want to see that. Seeing hurt more than denying, she preferred control. Dean tugged gently at his mother's sleeve. The gesture interrupted the argument, that he asked to stay a little longer. His voice came out low, almost pleading. Fernanda froze for a second. She had not expected a request like that. Months without requests, hope tried to slip in through a crack. She closed it quickly. Too much hope had hurt before. Fernanda said they were leaving. She said it as a final decision. Kaio felt the conflict tear inside him. Obeying felt safe. Defying felt necessary. Davi took another step back. Not out of rejection, but out of respect. Dean clenched his fists. The tension grew silently. Nothing there was simple. Fernanda looked at Davi and offered a curt apology. She said she did not want trouble, but made it clear that this would not happen again. Davi nodded with unexpected maturity, that he said he understood, that the decision was theirs. The sentence disarmed Kaio. There was no accusation, no resentment, only acceptance, that weighed more than any argument. As they walked away, Dean turned his face back, that he searched for the sound of Davi's voice. Kaio noticed and swallowed hard. Fernanda did not notice. She was too busy protecting herself. The park returned to its usual noise, but something had been left behind. Something that would not dissolve with distance. Kaio felt that the conversation was not over, that it had only changed location. On the way out, Dean held his father's hand tightly. Kaio recognized the silent request in that grip. Fernanda walked ahead, rigid. The conflict was set. Not between strangers but within the family, and Kaio knew that resistance had deep roots. Roots that would need to be touched with care. The story would not turn back now. The next step would require a choice, and no one would come away unscathed. The way back was far too silent. Kaio pushed the wheelchair with mechanical movements. Fernanda walked ahead, steps firm, jaw clenched. Dean held his father's hand like an anchor. The billionaire felt his mind locked in open dispute. On one side, reason trained in numbers and evidence. On the other, the rare glow in his son's eyes. No medical report could compete with that. Kaio did not want to believe, but he could not ignore it. Hope unraveled him with a cruel kind of delicacy. In the car, Fernanda spoke little. She reinforced that it could not happen again. She said false hope was dangerous. Kaio agreed in a low voice that he agreed mostly to end the conversation. Inside, something screamed the opposite. That he remembered Dean's reaction, the request to touch Davi's face, the small, forgotten laugh. None of that was imagined. Kaio took his son to his room. He helped him change clothes with ritual care. He watched every movement, alert for signs. Dean seemed more present, more alive. He asked simple questions about the park. Questions that had not come up in months. Kaio answered them all with renewed patience. He felt hope grow like contained fire. He tried to extinguish it with logic. He failed again. Later, he sat alone in his office. The walls full of awards brought no comfort. Success felt useless beside his son. He opened medical reports on his tablet. Read familiar diagnoses, technical words that explained without explaining. He closed everything with a sharp gesture. Reason was tired. His heart no longer accepted silence. Kaio needed to choose a risk. He asked himself what he truly had to lose. Another disappointment. His son already lived with that. More pain. Pain was already daily. What did he gain by denying it? Control, perhaps. But control healed no one. Kaio realized that protecting also meant risking, and that terrified him. He remembered his simple childhood. Bare feet in the mud, scraped knees. A time when he believed without proof. Money had taught him to doubt everything. Even what could not be measured. Meeting Davi had torn through that armor. Kaio felt ashamed of it. Ashamed of having forgotten the essential. Dean's glow confronted him, and he could not look away. That night, Kaio went into his son's room. He sat beside the bed. Dean asked if he would see the boy from the park again. The question came straight, without hesitation. Kaio took time to answer. He said he did not know. Honesty felt safer. Dean nodded, but did not give up. The silence carried a request. Kaio felt the weight of that trust. Fernanda watched from a distance, worried. She did not want to be the villain of the story. She only wanted to protect her son. But excessive protection also wounds. Kaio realized that too late. Hope, when denied, turns into frustration. He no longer wanted that for Dean. Even if it was an illusion, he needed to try. Kaio decided to talk to Davi. Under controlled conditions, as he promised himself. The decision was not spoken aloud, but it settled in firmly. Kaio knew Fernanda would react badly. He knew there would be conflict. Even so, something was irreversible. The glow in his son had awakened something in him. Something money could never buy. Reason no longer ruled alone. Hope was taking space, and the next step would require courage. Kaio sent a short message to the number Davi had left. No promises, no certainties, just a cautious invitation. A controlled environment, he said. A conversation, nothing more. When he pressed send, his heart raced. He knew he was crossing a line. There was no going back to comfortable ignorance. Fate was beginning to answer, and Fernanda did not yet know. Dean did not sleep well that night. He shifted his small body with a new restlessness. He called for his father more than once, without crying. When Kaio sat beside the bed, he heard the request. Just once, Dean said, his voice too firm for his age. There was no drama, no exaggerated pleading, there was decision. Kaio felt the immediate impact of that firmness. It was different from any previous request. It was an agreement being proposed. Dean explained with childlike care and his own logic. He said that if it did not work, he would never speak of it again. He promised not to insist, not to build hope. He spoke like someone negotiating something valuable. Kaio listened in silence, his heart tight. His son's maturity hurt more than pain. He realized Dean had already lost too much. That this request was also a preventive farewell. Either it worked, or it would be buried there. That dismantled every defense. Kaio tried to respond with reason. He spoke of emotional risks, of frustration. Dean listened to everything, attentive. Then he repeated only, just once. The phrase did not change, did not grow. It was simple, like a difficult truth. Kaio realized that denying it would be more cruel. Not because of the result, but because of denying the attempt. The boy was not asking for a cure. He was asking for a chance. The father held his son's face between his hands that he asked if he was afraid. Dean said yes. But he also said he was more afraid of not trying. The answer came clean, without rehearsal. Kaio felt the ground give way beneath reason. There was no argument against that. To deny it would be to deny his son's own voice. Hope was already there, alive. Pretending otherwise would be cowardice. Dean spoke of Davi with unexpected affection. That he said he seemed genuine, that his voice felt good, that the smell of the earth was calming. Kaio listened and realized something essential, that it was not about Clay, that it was about someone seeing his son without pity, without reports, without labels. Someone who spoke with Dean, not about him. That made all the difference. Kaio closed his eyes for a moment. That he took a deep breath, like someone accepting a calculated risk. That he said they would try once. Only once. Dean smiled in a way he had not smiled for months, not with explosive joy, but with deep relief, like someone receiving permission to feel. Kaio felt silent tears run down. That he did not try to hide them. The promise was sealed there, without witnesses, without applause. Kaio reinforced that it would be done with care, that they would stop at the slightest sign of suffering. Dean agreed with an adult seriousness. The agreement felt stronger than any contract. Kaio realized he was no longer the same. Something had changed inside him as well. Hope was no longer the enemy. That it was a risky partner. Fernanda heard the conversation from the hallway. She did not enter, but she heard everything. Her son's request pierced her armor. She did not agree, but she hesitated. For the first time she had no ready answer. Her fear began to crack. Not into trust yet, but into doubt. And doubt is always a door left ajar. Kaio noticed her silence. He knew the conflict was only beginning. The next morning, Kaio confirmed the meeting. A short, objective message. No promises, no expectations. Davi replied simply that he said he would come. He said only that. Dean waited with contained anxiety. He asked the time, counted the minutes. The request made could no longer be undone, and the next step was already approaching. Kaio chose the mansion as neutral territory. A controlled environment, discreet security, clear rules. It was his way of keeping some sense of control. He called Davi and explained the conditions. No promises, no spectacle. Just one attempt, brief and supervised. Davi listened in silence and agreed. He asked for nothing beyond the necessary time. Kaio hung up, feeling the weight of the decision. The house would no longer be a refuge. When Fernanda found out, she reacted with immediate indignation. She said it was irresponsible, that they were bringing a stranger into the house. The word stranger carried contempt and fear. Kaio tried to explain the need for control. Fernanda did not want to listen. She spoke of security, of image, of consequences. She spoke of pain as well, without realizing it. The mansion, a symbol of protection, became a battlefield. The conflict became explicit. Fernanda accused Kaio of playing with their son's emotions. She said that improvised hope would be devastating. Kaio responded with unusual calm. He said that devastating was denying Dean's request. The sentence fell heavily in the air. Fernanda fell silent for a moment. Not because she agreed, but because she had no ready answer. Their love for their son took different forms, and that placed them on opposite sides. Dean heard the argument from a distance. His small body grew tense. Kaio interrupted the conversation when he noticed that he went to his son and explained carefully. He said Davi would come only to talk. Dean nodded, but the glow in his eyes revealed expectation. Fernanda saw it and looked away. Seeing that hurt more than admitting it. She feared the fall after the flight. She feared not being able to catch him. The house felt different that day. The silence in the corridors was heavier. The staff sensed the tension in the air. The mansion, accustomed to order and predictability, now awaited something it could not control. Kaio paced restlessly. Fernanda kept emotional distance. Dean asked simple, repeated questions. Each question was a countdown. Nothing there was just logistics. Fernanda asked if Kaio was prepared for failure, prepared for their son's tears. Kaio answered with disarming honesty. He said he was not, but that he was prepared to be present. The phrase echoed louder than any argument. Fernanda felt the ground give a little. Not enough to accept, but enough to hesitate. Kaio set clear rules for the meeting. No clay on the eyes without consent. No stories without pauses. Nothing beyond limits. Davi had agreed to everything. The discipline surprised Kaio. It was not improvised charlatanism. There was method within the simplicity, that left him even more divided. Hope grew silently. Night fell with a strange weight. Dean took a long time to fall asleep. He asked if Davi would really come. Kaio confirmed, trying not to fuel expectations. Dean held his father's hand longer. Fernanda watched from the doorway. She felt excluded from the decision, and at the same time an involuntary accomplice. Love kept her from fully stepping back. but fear still dominated. Deep down, Fernanda feared being deceived, she feared allowing herself to believe. Past pain was still alive, she had promised herself never to build false hope again. But her son asked differently, and her husband chose differently. The mansion awaited the unlikely visitor. The meeting was set, and nothing there felt too small to collapse. The next day would bring more than conversation. Dean woke up before the scheduled time. His body felt electric, restless that he asked the time before even opening his eyes. Kaio answered with renewed patience that he could not remember the last time his son had woken up like this. The anxiety tasted like life. Dean asked question after question. Simple questions but full of intention. Kaio noticed the return of something lost. Childhood was coming back in small signs. The boy asked to change clothes early, that he chose his favorite t-shirt by the feel of the fabric, that he said he wanted to be comfortable. Kaio helped with extra care. Every gesture felt like part of a silent ritual. Fernanda watched from the doorway, silent, her unease mixed with surprise. Dean was more talkative, more present. She did not know whether to celebrate or protect. Fear still spoke louder. Dean asked if Davi was tall or short, that he asked if he smiled, that he asked if he had siblings. Kaio answered what he knew and what he did not. Honesty felt safer. The boy listened attentively, absorbing details, that he built his own images in the dark, that showed an active imagination. Something pain had frozen. Kaio felt his chest warm. The house still slept in formal silence. The long corridors amplified footsteps. Dean asked to go downstairs before it was time. Kaio tried to delay it but gave in. They went down together to the garden. The morning air was fresh. Dean breathed deeply and smiled, that he said the smell reminded him of the park. Kaio sensed the connection forming. Everything was slowly stitching itself together. Fernanda came down shortly after. She saw her son in the garden, attentive to sounds that he described the birdsong. Something he had not done in a long time. Her heart tightened. Reason tried to hold firm, but the image of her son being so alive disarmed her. That it was not healing yet, but it was presence, and that carried weight. Dean asked when Davi would arrive. Kaio said there was still some time. The boy nodded, but could not hold back that he said he had dreamed of colors, that he did not describe which ones, that he only said they existed. Kaio swallowed hard. Fernanda closed her eyes for a moment. The dream stirred them both. Fear and hope collided. The clock felt painfully slow. Dean tapped his fingers on the arm of the chair. Not from nervousness but anticipation. Kaio sat beside him, trying to calm him. The boy held his father's hand, and he said he was happy. The word sounded too strong for an ordinary Sunday. Fernanda felt a knot form, that happiness was fragile. But it was real. Dean's anxiety infected the atmosphere. Staff members exchanged curious glances. The mansion felt smaller. Kaio realized there was no turning back. The meeting was already having an effect before it even happened. That frightened and comforted him at the same time. Fernanda remained divided. She did not know if she was about to witness a mistake or the beginning of something greater. Waiting was taking its toll. A car slowed down outside. Dean turned his face toward the sound. Kaio stood up immediately. Fernanda felt her heart race. The moment had arrived sooner than expected. Anxiety took concrete form. The gate began to open. The garden held its breath. Dean smiled without knowing why, and the improbable crossed the boundary of the house. Davi walked through the gate with measured steps, that he was cleaner now, his face washed, his hair arranged in his own way. The cloth bag hung from his shoulder like an ancient object. The contrast was immediate and striking. The immaculate garden, the simple boy. Kaio felt a discomfort that was hard to name. It was not shame, it was awareness. Davi stopped before moving too far, and he waited, respectful, as if asking permission from the space. The mansion seemed to be watching him. Fernanda was the first to react. Her eyes scanned the boy from head to toe. There was no explicit contempt, but there was distance. Davi noticed and was not offended that he had learned early how to read hostile environments, that he greeted them with simple politeness. His voice came out steady, without submissiveness. That unsettled Fernanda. She expected excessive humility, she received quiet dignity. Dean turned his face toward Davi. He recognized the voice immediately. He smiled, an open smile, without reservation. He extended his hand into the air, confident. Davi approached slowly. He placed his own hand over Dean's. The gesture was simple and powerful. Kaio felt the physical impact of that connection. It was as if his son recognized something familiar. Something safe. The cloth bag drew everyone's attention. Davi held it with almost ceremonial care. Kaio asked if the clay was inside. Davi confirmed with a brief nod. He said he had gathered it that morning. He explained that it needed to be fresh. Fernanda took a deep breath, tense. The word clay still sounded absurd. But the atmosphere was not one of charlatanism, that it was one of silent ritual. Davi asked to get to know the space. Not out of curiosity but out of necessity, that he said he needed to feel the environment. Kaio allowed it, watching every step. They walked through the garden. Davi touched the soil, the plants, that he closed his eyes for a moment. Fernanda watched with growing distrust, that it felt like a symbolic invasion. But Dean seemed calm. Davi remarked that the house breathed heavily, not as criticism, but as observation, that he said places also store fear. Kaio felt the words hit deeply. The mansion had been built for security, but also for isolation. Dean listened in attentive silence. Fernanda looked away. The idea that the house influenced her son unsettled her, but it made too much sense to ignore. Davi asked them to sit in the garden, that he said it was better to begin there. Kaio agreed, relieved it would not be inside the house. Fernanda remained standing for a moment, to ask if she could still stop everything. Then she sat down, overcome by curiosity. Dean breathed deeply, anxious. The cloth bag was placed on the ground. The moment felt suspended. Nothing there was casual. Davi explained that he would do nothing without consent, that the boy needed to want it. Dean answered before anyone else that he said he wanted to. The certainty in his voice surprised his parents. Fernanda felt her heart tighten. Kaio felt pride and fear together. His son's autonomy was frightening, but it also showed strength. Davi nodded, respectful. The social contrast remained evident, the simple boy and the powerful family. But within that improvised circle it lost force. The focus shifted. Dean's body seemed to respond to the environment. More relaxed, more present. Davi observed attentively, without hurry. Kaio realized this was not an act. There was method within the simplicity, and the next step would require silence. Davi opened the bag slowly. The smell of wet earth spread through the air. Dean inhaled deeply, as if recognizing something ancient. Fernanda closed her eyes, tense. Kaio held his breath. The garden seemed quieter. The mansion, less imposing. The initial moment was complete. Nothing had happened yet, but everything was already in motion. Davi did not start with the clay. That he began with words, spoken low and firm. That he explained that it was neither magic nor a promise. That he called it guided care, as he had learned from his grandmother. That he said the body needs to feel safe before it can remember. That forcing blocks, that pressure pushes away. Fernanda crossed her arms, defensive. Kaio listened with absolute attention. Dean remained still, curious. The ritual began with agreement. Davi explained the rules simply: clay around the eyes, never inside. 15 minutes of silence and story. No questions during the process. If fear appeared, everything stopped. Dean listened to every word seriously. He asked if he could say stop. Davi replied yes at any moment. That visibly relaxed the boy. Having control returned made a difference. Kaio asked why stories. Davi answered that the mind opens doors, that stories distract fear while the body works. That he spoke of images that guide without forcing. Nothing technical but coherent. Fernanda rolled her eyes, still resistant. But she did not interrupt. Curiosity was beginning to compete with denial. Dean nodded, absorbing everything. That he seemed to trust him. Davi explained that the clay was cold, that the cold helped awaken the face. Not to heal but to signal presence. That he said that when the body feels, it responds. Kaio remembered sensory therapies. The similarity surprised him. It was not formal science, but it was not absurd either. The boundary between the two worlds trembled. Fernanda noticed her husband's hesitation. That made her even more tense. Davi asked for silence around them. Not as an order but as an invitation. That he said the house needed to listen too. The phrase sounded strange, but no one objected. The garden seemed quieter. Even the birds softened their song. Dean breathed deeply, ready. Kaio held his own anxiety. Fernanda watched every detail, ready to interrupt. Time seemed suspended. Davi said he would tell a specific story. The story of a boy who lost his colors. That he did not say the ending. He said each person finds their own. Dean smiled, interested. He asked if the boy in the story was afraid. Davi answered that yes, very much, but that he was not alone. The answer touched something deep. Kaio felt a knot in his throat. The clay was shown up close, thick texture, dark, alive. Dean asked to touch it first. Davi allowed it. The boy's fingers sank slightly. He commented that it was cold and heavy. He smiled again, without fear. Fernanda held her breath. Kaio realized his son was fully there, more present than he had been in months. Davi asked if everyone agreed. Kaio answered first, firmly. He said yes. Fernanda took a little longer. Her silence was heavy. Then she nodded, almost imperceptibly, not out of belief but out of love. Dean heard his mother's consent. That finally put him at ease. The circle was closed. Davi explained that the 15 minutes were essential. No more, no less. That stopping early broke the flow. That going beyond the time tired the body. The precision surprised Kaio. It did not seem improvised. It felt like a tradition tested by time. Fernanda mentally noted every detail, ready to question later. For now, she only watched. With everything explained, Davi waited. He did not begin on his own. He looked at Dean and waited for the signal. The boy took a deep breath and nodded. Kaio felt his heart race. Fernanda closed her eyes for a second. The ritual had not yet begun. But the decision had already been made. The next step would change everything, and no one there was sure what would come next. Davi began applying the clay with slow movements. He did not touch the eyes, only the careful outline around them. Dean remained still, breathing deeply. The cold of the clay made the boy shiver slightly, not from fear, but from novelty. Kaio leaned forward, attentive to every gesture. Fernanda kept her hands tightly clasped. The garden seemed quieter than before. As if it were waiting for the next sound. Time began to count. Davi asked Dean to keep his eyes closed. His voice was calm, almost musical. He said the clay helped the face wake up. Dean nodded, confident. The boy commented that the cold felt good. That eased some of the parents' tension. Kaio felt his chest tighten less. Fernanda released her breath slowly. Nothing wrong was happening. The simple was already a victory. Davi began the story in a low voice. He spoke of a boy who lived in a gray world. Not because the world was that way, but because he was afraid to look. Dean listened attentively without moving. Each word seemed to find its place. Kaio sensed the right rhythm. There was no rush, no dramatization. It was a narrative that invited, not pushed. Dean's body relaxed. The story described forgotten colors. Blue of the sky, green of the grass, yellow of the sun. Davi spoke slowly, drawing images in the air. Dean breathed at the same pace. The boy seemed to follow each scene. Fernanda felt her heart tighten. The words slipped past old defenses. It was not about sight yet. It was about emotional memory, and that alone was powerful. The clay began to dry slightly. Davi adjusted a spot with care. He asked if Dean was comfortable. The boy answered yes. He said he felt calm. Kaio noticed something different in his tone, more grounded, less distant. The calm was not apathy. It was full presence. That moved him deeply. The story moved to the fear of the gray boy. It spoke of a day when he fell and everything went dark. Davi did not detail the accident. He left space for silence. Dean furrowed his brow slightly. Kaio felt the impact of the metaphor. Fernanda pressed her lips together. The theme cut too deep. But no one interrupted. Silence was part of the care. Davi said that the boy in the story believed that if he opened his eyes, the pain would return. That darkness was protection. Dean swallowed hard. A small movement, but visible. Kaio noticed and restrained the urge to intervene. Fernanda felt her entire body react. The story was stitching together hidden truths. Nothing explicit, nothing forced, delicacy was the key. The wind passed more strongly through the garden. The leaves rustled in response. Davi kept his voice steady. He said someone held the gray boy's hand, and said he was not alone. Dean breathed more deeply. His hand moved slightly. Kaio held it, present. Fernanda felt silent tears appear. The scene touched the whole family. As the 15 minutes approached, Davi slowed the pace of the story. He said the boy began to sense shadows. Not colors yet, just shapes. Shadows that moved carefully. Dean nodded faintly. The gesture was almost imperceptible. But Kaio saw it, Fernanda saw it. The air grew heavier. Davi ended the story gently. He warned that he would clean the clay. He asked Dean to open his eyes slowly. Kaio held his breath. Fernanda felt her heart race. The damp cloth touched the boy's face. The clay came away slowly. Nothing seemed different at first glance, but the silence that followed was new, and it carried something that did not yet have a name. Davi finished cleaning Dean's face with absolute care. The cloth was pulled away slowly, without haste. The boy kept his eyes open, breathing deeply. There was no immediate exclamation, no theatrical gesture. Expectation hung suspended in the air. Kaio felt his heartbeat echo in his ears. Fernanda remained still, almost rigid. The garden seemed to hold its breath along with them. Davi watched in silence, attentive to every micro-reaction. Nothing was forced. Dean blinked a few times, confused. He brought his hand to his face, touching his own skin. He said everything felt normal. The sentence almost broke Kaio. But then Dean frowned, intrigued. He commented that something felt different. That he did not explain right away. That he seemed to be searching for words for something new. Silence imposed itself again. Davi did not interrupt. Dean said he could see something moving. Not a shape, not a color. Just shadow. A difference between light and dark. Kaio felt his entire body shiver. Fernanda took a step forward without realizing it. Davi remained calm as if he expected this. That he asked where the shadow was. Dean vaguely pointed toward the garden. The simple gesture shattered the emotional ground. Kaio asked if he was sure. His voice came out trembling, betraying control. Dean answered yes. Not with euphoria but with conviction. That he said it was not imagination. That something was there, even if blurred. Fernanda brought her hand to her mouth. Reason screamed inside her. But her son's gesture spoke louder. She could not deny it. Davi explained cautiously that he said shadows were half-open doors. That no guarantee of anything. Just a sign that the body was beginning to trust. Kaio felt hope ignite inside him. That he tried to restrain it, unsuccessfully. His hands trembled slightly. Fernanda closed her eyes for a moment. Fear and hope collided with force. She did not know which would win. Dean commented that the shadow seemed big. That he said it moved when someone moved. Kaio deliberately changed position. Dean reacted immediately. A smile appeared, incredulous. That it was not full joy, it was pure surprise. Kaio felt tears escape. Fernanda was breathing far too fast. Davi watched without celebrating. That he knew excess could break the thread. The boy asked if it was real. Kaio answered yes, trying to keep his voice steady. Fernanda said nothing. Emotion had completely frozen her. Davi reinforced that it was early, that the body needed time, that nothing was guaranteed. Dean nodded, serious. His maturity surprised them again. That he did not ask for more. The atmosphere in the garden changed completely. There were no shouts, no celebration. There was reverence. That as if something sacred had touched the ground. Kaio felt the world reorder its priorities. Everything that once seemed big became small. Fernanda felt her heart give a little. That it was not faith yet, but it was deep doubt, and that already changed everything. Davi suggested ending there. That he said the body needed rest. Kaio agreed immediately. Fernanda nodded in silence. Dean asked if he could try again another day. The question came softly, carefully. Davi replied that maybe, that it would depend on the body and on courage. The answer opened a new space for hope, without empty promises. When Dean closed his eyes again, he said the shadow was still there. Even without looking. Kaio felt the impact of the sentence. That it was not something fleeting from that moment. That it was bodily memory activating. Fernanda finally let the tears fall. No loud crying, just truth. The first sign was not a cure, but it was impossible to ignore. As he stood up, Kaio realized nothing would be the same. Logic could not account for what he had felt. Fernanda knew control was beginning to slip away. Davi gathered his bag calmly. Dean remained smiling in silence. The garden seemed more alive. The miracle did not yet have a name, but it already had presence, and the next step would require a greater decision. The story was far from over. The sun was already sinking when Davi broke the silence. That he did not speak of results, nor of what would come next. That he spoke of himself, for the first time with real weight. That he said he did not have a permanent home. That he lived between tired ants and periods in shelters. That going back and forth from the mountain would be difficult. His voice came out calm, but heavy. It was not an explicit request. That it was an honest statement. Kaio felt the impact immediately. Fernanda reacted before her thoughts could organize. Her body stiffened, her expression closed. This went beyond every agreed boundary. That it was no longer a controlled meeting. That it was life walking through the front door. She opened her mouth to interrupt. But Dean spoke first. That he said he wanted Davi to stay. The sentence fell like a stone in a lake. Silent ripples spread outward. Kaio felt the ground shift beneath his feet. That he looked at his son, then at Davi. Logic screamed danger. Business instinct demanded caution. But his heart remembered the boy's smile. The shadow perceived minutes earlier. Kaio asked how long Davi would need. Davi answered that he did not know. That Dean's body would decide. The answer was not reassuring, but it felt true. Fernanda finally spoke. She said it was madness. That you do not take in a stranger like that. That they were confusing gratitude with responsibility. The word stranger cut the air again. Dean shrank slightly. Kaio noticed and intervened. That he said they would not decide anything now, but that they needed to consider it. The pause prevented an explosion. Davi remained respectfully silent. That he did not insist, did not defend himself. That he had learned that those who need to convince lose strength. His posture unsettled Fernanda. There was no opportunism there. There was controlled vulnerability, that confused her even more. Kaio felt the balance begin to tilt. The boy did not seem to want to take advantage. That he simply seemed tired. Dean asked to hold Davi's hand. The gesture was simple but decisive. Kaio allowed it with a nod. Fernanda watched, motionless. The two boys stayed that way for a few seconds. No words, no expectations. The scene said more than any argument. Kaio felt his eyes burn. The mansion seemed far too small for that moment. Something greater was imposing itself. Kaio offered the guest room. He spoke with a controlled, almost technical voice. Like someone presenting a temporary solution. Fernanda turned immediately. She was about to protest, but stopped. Her son's look froze her. She realized that denying it now would break something fragile. Something that had barely begun to form. Her silence was heavy, but it was consent. Davi thanked them without exaggeration. He did not smile broadly, did not celebrate. He simply thanked them. He said he would respect all the rules, that he would do nothing without authorization. His maturity contrasted with his age. Kaio realized the responsibility was already there. It was not something they were creating. It was old survival. That hurt more than it helped. Fernanda stepped away into the house. She needed to breathe away from there. Kaio remained in the garden. Dean seemed calmer than he had been in months. He asked if Davi would sleep there. Kaio answered yes for now. The smile that appeared was serene. It was not euphoria. It was security, and that was frightening. When night fell, the decision had already been made. Even without official words, Davi entered the mansion not as a visitor, but as someone who would stay. Fernanda felt fear grow. Kaio felt hope take up new spaces. Dean felt something even simpler. He felt that he was not alone, and that request changed everything. The greater conflict was still to come. The house fell silent in a strange way that night. It was not the usual silence of the mansion. It was a silence heavy with things left unsaid. Fernanda waited until Dean was asleep to speak. She entered Kaio's office without knocking. She closed the door with excessive care. The gesture revealed the conflict. She needed to talk, but she did not want to wake the house. Her voice came out low, tense. Pain came before anger. Fernanda asked if Kaio had any idea what he had done. She did not shout, did not accuse him right away. She spoke like someone trying to understand before exploding. She said they were playing with their son's emotions. That false hope leaves deep scars. Scars that do not show up on exams. She knew those scars well. Kaio listened without interrupting. He knew he had to let the pain come out. The confrontation was inevitable. She spoke of the accident with her voice breaking. Of the day everything went dark for Dean. Of the fear of seeing him suffer again. Fernanda said she could not bear to break her son a second time. That she preferred the familiar darkness to a light that deceives. The phrase hurt Kaio. But he understood where it came from. Her protection was made of trauma, not coldness, that kept him from responding harshly. Kaio answered with rare calm. He said he was afraid too. That he did not believe in easy miracles. But that he had seen something different that day. He spoke of Dean's request, of the light in his eyes. He said denying that would be abandoning him from the inside. The phrase hung in the air. Fernanda closed her eyes for a moment. The idea hit her hard. Abandoning without leaving. Fernanda questioned Davi's presence. She said taking the boy in was dangerous. That they did not know his full story. Kaio agreed cautiously. He said they were watching, setting limits. But he added something that changed the tone. He said Davi was not asking for anything. That he did not demand, did not promise. That he was simply there, and that was too rare to ignore. She accused Kaio of fooling himself. Of projecting an impossible salvation onto the boy. Kaio took a deep breath before responding. He said he was not seeking salvation. He was seeking presence, effort, dignity. He said their son had already suffered too much. That living without trying was also a form of abandonment. Fernanda felt her defenses crack. The sentence touched a sensitive place. She had no ready answer. Fernanda asked what they would do if everything went wrong. If Dean woke up worse. If the shadow disappeared. Kaio answered with hard honesty. He said he would be there. That he would hold his son in his arms. That he would not promise healing, only presence. The answer did not bring immediate peace, but it brought truth, and truth disarms. She cried for the first time that night. Not loudly but quietly. Kaio stepped closer without touching her. He respected her space. Fernanda confessed she was afraid to believe. Afraid to let herself dream, because broken dreams hurt more. Kaio nodded in silence. He had that fear too. But he had chosen to walk forward despite it. Fernanda said she would not stop it for now. She did not call it agreement. She called it vigilance. She said she would watch every step. That at the slightest sign of suffering, everything would stop. Kaio accepted without arguing. It was a possible agreement. Not ideal but real. Their love for their son found a fragile middle ground, and that was enough to continue. When Fernanda left the office, Kaio remained alone for a few minutes. He felt the weight of responsibility grow heavier. There was no victory there. Only a narrow path opening ahead. The risk was still enormous. But the alternative was emptiness. Kaio chose conscious risk. He knew the next step would touch old wounds, and that the greatest obstacle was still hidden. The next morning, Davi asked to talk before anything else. He did not bring clay, did not speak of sessions. He sat in the garden with a serene posture. He said he needed to understand the origin of the silence. Kaio sensed the gravity of the request. Fernanda remained standing, distrustful. Dean listened attentively, his body still. Davi explained that sometimes the problem is not in the it is in the fear that commands the body to close. The sentence fell heavily into the air. Davi spoke carefully about trauma, that he said that when something hurts too much, the body learns to protect itself. That the mind can erase parts of the world in order to survive. That he did not use medical terms, but it made sense. Kaio felt a chill run down his spine. Fernanda immediately looked away. The subject they had avoided for months appeared without asking permission. Dean frowned slightly, that he seemed to recognize something there. Silence took on a new meaning. Davi asked if Dean remembered the accident. The question came softly, almost whispered. Dean took a long time to answer. His fingers tightened around the arm of the chair. Kaio felt the urge to interrupt. Fernanda stepped forward. But Davi raised his hand, asking for calm. That he said Dean did not need to answer now. That sometimes the question itself begins the work. That calmed the atmosphere. Davi explained that the blindness could be a shield, a way for the body to say enough. That not seeing can also be a way of not reliving. Kaio felt his throat close. Fernanda brought a hand to her chest. The idea was too cruel to ignore. They had never spoken about this with Dean. They had never named the fear. They had chosen exams and silence instead. The cost of that choice was beginning to show. Dean asked if the fault was his. The question came fast, sharp. Kaio felt as if the ground opened beneath him. Fernanda answered immediately, denying it forcefully. Davi reinforced calmly that he said the body reacts to protect. That there is no guilt in surviving. Dean took a deep breath when he heard that. The words seemed to lift an old weight. Something inside him began to loosen. Davi suggested that they talk about the accident. Not there, not at that moment. But soon, with care, that he said truth needs a safe space. Kaio realized they had failed at that. Overprotection also hurts. Fernanda felt guilt seep in. Not as accusation but as late learning. Dean remained attentive, less tense. Fear was beginning to be named. Davi told a short story from his grandmother. About a boy who closed his eyes so he would not see the fire, and who only opened them again when someone stayed with him in the darkness. The metaphor struck deeply. Kaio felt his heart beat heavily. Fernanda realized she had always tried to pull Dean toward the light by force, without first staying with him in the dark. The realization hurt. But it was the kind of pain that teaches. The path was being redrawn. Dean asked if he needed to talk now. Davi answered that he did not. That time was an ally. That the body decides when it is safe. Kaio felt immediate relief. Fernanda breathed more easily. No one was being pushed. The key to the trauma had been presented, not turned yet, but it was there, visible. Davi said that next time they would not use only clay. They would use true words. Words no one had dared to say. Kaio felt the weight of responsibility settle in. Fernanda felt fear grow and shrink at the same time. Dean seemed calmer than ever. The trauma, once invisible, now had shape, and shapes can be touched. The next step would require emotional courage, and no one would come out of that dive unscathed. Kaio chose the late afternoon for the conversation. The light was softer, less invasive. They sat in Dean's bedroom, doors open. No hospital, no clinic. It was home, it was safety. Davi stayed nearby without interfering. Fernanda sat beside her son, tense. Kaio took a deep breath before beginning. His voice came out low, honest. There was no possible script for that. Kaio spoke about the accident for the first time, without graphic details, without exaggerated drama. That he spoke of the noise, the impact, the fear. That he said he was terrified too. That he thought he would lose his son. The confession broke an old silence. Dean listened with absolute attention. Fernanda felt her heart tighten. They had never said this out loud before. The secret weighed more than the truth. Kaio said that after the accident he was afraid to talk. Afraid of making his son relive the pain. That he thought silence would protect him. But now he saw that silence isolated him. That he apologized. Not out of guilt, but out of responsibility. Dean blinked a few times. The word sorry felt new. That he had never heard that from his parents. Healing began there. Dean asked if his father was going to leave. The question came quickly, cutting through the air. Kaio felt the physical impact. That he said he would never leave. That he would be there even if Dean never saw again. That love did not depend on a cure. Fernanda reinforced it by squeezing her son's hand. The words went deep. The oldest fear was named, and it began to lose its power. Dean began to talk about what he felt. That he said the darkness felt safe. That when he could not see, he did not remember the accident. That he was afraid to open his eyes and have everything come back. Kaio listened without interrupting. Fernanda cried silently. The truth was finally circulating. There were no more secrets between them. Shared pain felt smaller. The room breathed differently. Davi intervened only to remind them that he said Dean could stop whenever he wanted. The boy chose to continue. Having autonomy restored gave him strength. Dean spoke about the fear of disappointing his parents, that he said he felt guilty for not getting better. The sentence cut deeply. Fernanda hugged her son tightly. She said he did not need to get better to be loved. The guilt began to dissolve. Caio promised something simple, that he did not promise a cure, that he promised presence, that he promised to stay in the dark with him if needed. The promise was more powerful than any miracle. Dean took a deep breath, relieved. His body seemed to relax, as if the danger had passed. The conversation was healing from the inside, even without immediate visible results. Dean said he felt something different now, not vision but lightness, as if his chest felt less tight. Davi nodded discreetly. That was exactly what he expected. Inner healing usually comes first. Fernanda felt her heart slow down. Caio realized something had reorganized itself. There was no euphoria, only peace, and peace is fertile ground. At the end, Dean asked to sleep, that he said he was tired, but okay. Caio covered him carefully. Fernanda kissed her son's forehead. Davi withdrew in silence. The house became quiet again, but not empty. Something had been said, something that could not be unsaid, and the next step would meet a freer body. The next morning Dean woke up calmer. There was no electric anxiety, but a quiet sense of presence, that he asked to go to the garden again. Caio noticed the difference in his tone, that it was not blind expectation, but serene curiosity. Fernanda followed in silence, attentive to every gesture. Davi prepared the space with the same care as before. No rush, no promises, the body now knew the path. And that changed everything. Davi explained that the second session would be different. Less clay, more listening, that he said the body needed to test the newly created sense of safety. That he applied the clay again around the eyes. This time, Dean did not flinch. The cold no longer frightened him. It was almost familiar. Caio felt his chest tighten with restrained emotion. Fernanda noticed the change in her son, that he seemed confident. The story began shorter. Davi spoke of shapes emerging in the dark, not colors, not details, just outlines that begin to make sense. Dean breathed deeply, attentive. His body remained relaxed, his mind did not flee. Caio held back his own anxiety. Fernanda kept her eyes fixed on her son. Time seemed to obey their rhythm. When the clay was removed, Dean opened his eyes slowly. He blinked once, twice. Silence settled in again. Davi waited without moving. Dean furrowed his brow, focused. He said he saw something different. Not just shadow now. He said there were shapes. Large, nearby shapes. Caio shifted slightly. Dean followed the movement with his face. Not with total precision but with clear intention. Fernanda pressed a hand to her chest. Her son's gesture was not random. He was responding to space. Dean described something tall in front of him. He said it seemed like people. The word echoed strongly. No one breathed. Davi asked how many shapes. Dean replied that there were 2.1 bigger, one smaller. Caio felt the immediate impact. Fernanda felt her legs weaken. Dean did not see details, but he recognized human presence. That went beyond coincidence. Davi remained calm. He knew excitement would break the process. Dean smiled, surprised at himself. He did not celebrate. He seemed more intrigued than happy. He said the shapes were moving, that they were not still. Caio moved his hand slowly. Dean followed with minimal delay. Fernanda felt tears rise. Her reason screamed caution, but her son's body spoke louder. Davi asked everyone to speak softly. He said the body was still learning. Dean nodded, serious. His maturity was impressive. No childish euphoria. It was conscious discovery. Caio felt pride and fear together. Fernanda watched, divided. She did not know if it was psychological or a miracle, but she saw her son coming back to life. Dean commented that he no longer felt the urge to close his eyes. The sentence cut through the air like lightning. Caio felt his heart race. Fernanda brought a hand to her mouth. The fear that had sustained everything began to give way. Not by obligation but through internal safety. Davi nodded discreetly. That was the sign he had been waiting for. Courage was returning to the body, and that changed the physical response. The session ended without applause, without promises, without labels. Dean was tired, but calm. He said he wanted to rest. Caio carried him carefully. Fernanda remained in the garden for a moment. Her inner conflict was reorganizing. She did not know what to believe, but she knew what she was seeing, and that was impossible to ignore. That night, Fernanda went into her son's room. Dean described the shapes again, contained excitement in his voice. He said it felt like the world was slowly coming back. Fernanda sat on the bed and listened in silence. The fear was still there, but it no longer ruled alone. Doubt was giving way to cautious hope. The third session was approaching, and something inside her said nothing would ever be the same. The morning was different, as if it knew what was at stake. Dean woke up asking for light, no longer shadow, that he wanted to feel the sun on his face before going to the garden. Caio complied in reverent silence. Fernanda watched every gesture, her heart on alert. Davi prepared the space with even greater calm that he said it was not an ordinary day. Not because of a promise but because of deep listening. Dean's body seemed ready. And that changed the entire atmosphere. The clay was applied in a smaller amount. Its texture felt almost symbolic now. Dean did not tense up, did not stiffen. That he breathed with a new sense of ease. Davi explained that today he would speak little. That the body already knew the path. Caio held his son's hand. Fernanda sat nearby without barriers. The garden felt wide and welcoming. Nothing needed to be forced. Davi asked Dean to open his eyes slowly. Not later, now. The request surprised the parents. Dean obeyed with calm courage. That he blinked a few times. The silence stretched on. Caio felt his heart race. Fernanda barely breathed. Dean furrowed his brow, focused. Something was happening. Dean said he saw something different in the shapes. Not just outlines. That he said one of the shapes was blue. The word landed like a contained thunderclap. Caio felt his legs weaken. Fernanda pressed a hand to her chest, incredulous. Davi remained still, attentive. That he asked carefully where the blue was. Dean pointed toward his father. That it was Caio's shirt. The boy blinked again, overwhelmed. That he said the other shape had yellow. That he slowly turned his face. That he pointed toward his mother. That it was Fernanda's dress. The world seemed to stop. Caio let the tears fall without restraint. Fernanda dropped to her knees, crying. That it was not shadow, it was not shape. That it was color. Dean laughed softly, surprised at himself. That it was not a laugh of victory. That it was a laugh of reunion. That he said the blue was beautiful. That the yellow felt warm. Caio could not respond. His voice simply would not come out. Fernanda held her son tightly. As if afraid to wake up. But nothing there was a dream. Davi spoke only what was necessary. That he said it was not the end, that the body needed time. But that step was real. That he asked for no credit, no thanks. That he knelt and touched the earth with respect. Caio grasped the magnitude of the moment. Nothing there was spectacle. That it was life returning in layers, and that required ongoing care. Dean continued describing what he saw. That he spoke of the green of the plants. Of the clear sky above them. The words came with restrained emotion. Fernanda cried without stopping. Caio held his son like an anchor. The entire mansion seemed to breathe in relief. The staff, at a distance, sensed something different. The impossible was taking concrete shape, and no one dared to interrupt. Davi ended the session early. That he said the body needed to rest. Dean nodded, still smiling. That he wanted no more, asked for no more. Excess could harm. Caio understood the wisdom of the limit. Fernanda gave thanks in silence. Not with words but with her eyes. The gratitude was too deep for sound. The garden grew quiet again. That day the entire house cried. Not from sadness but from relief. Dean slept with the light on for the first time. That he said he liked seeing the room. Caio and Fernanda stood in the doorway watching. Their son was seeing the world again. Not fully, not completely, but enough to reignite life. The third session was not an ending. That it was a silent rebirth. Time passed quietly, as if honoring something sacred. Dean continued to regain his sight little by little, without haste. There were no announcements, no interviews. Caio chose to protect the process above all else. The mansion became a true home. Davi stopped being a guest and became family. Not by decree, but through daily coexistence. Fernanda watched, still cautious. But something in her was healing too. The impossible was slowly becoming ordinary. Davi shared more about his grandmother, Mrs. Julieta. Simple stories of care and listening. He spoke of forgotten people she helped. Without fame, without recognition. Caio listened with both strategic and human attention. He realized there was a legacy there. Not a fixed method, but a principle. Helping without promising, welcoming without invading. The idea began to take shape. A mission was born in silence. Fernanda was the first to suggest something concrete. She said other children deserved a dignified attempt. Not a miracle, an attempt. That word changed everything. Caio agreed immediately. He used resources, contacts, structure. But kept his heart in command. No spectacle, no publicity. The foundation would be born discreetly, inspired by a grandmother who never sought the spotlight. Dean took part in the decision. He said he wanted to help children like him. He did not speak of healing. He spoke of not feeling alone. That sentence became their compass. Davi smiled with tear-filled eyes. He had never asked for anything. Now he was part of something bigger. The family was being redrawn. Not by blood, but by choice. The phrase, mud on your face, took on a new meaning. It became an internal, almost secret symbol. It represented facing the improbable without fear. getting dirty to see more clearly, accepting what does not fit in a report. Kaio recognized the perfect irony. What once sounded like a threat became a doorway. Fernanda learned to smile when remembering it. Dean repeated the phrase playfully. The trauma lost strength with every laugh. The foundation began small. Simple, careful support. Stories, listening, presence. Some children improved. Others did not. But all of them were seen. That alone was real transformation. Kaio learned that impact is not numbers. It is lives touched with respect. Success took on a new meaning. Davi began formal studies, not to abandon what he had learned, but to expand the care. Kaio supported him without imposing. Fernanda encouraged him with affection. Dean was proud of his chosen brother. The word brother came naturally. The family no longer needed explanations. They simply were. The home had expanded. Years later, Dean walked through the garden, still with limits, still with care, but walking while seeing the world. That he stopped by the artificial stream, looked at the wet earth and smiled. That he remembered the first meeting in the park. Kaio watched from a distance, emotional. Fernanda held his hand. The old pain now taught lessons. Nothing had been in vain. The miracle was not only the sight. It was the courage to it was the choice to listen. It was staying in the dark before pulling toward the light. The family learned this together, and chose to live that way, with less control and more presence, with less fear and more truth. The mud did not dirty their faces. It opened their eyes to what truly matters. In the end, this story is not just about sight. It is about courage. The courage to try when everyone says to accept. The courage to listen to a child when the world tells you to stay silent. The courage to soil your own certainties with mud in order to see beyond the obvious. Maybe the greatest miracle was not color returning to Dean's eyes. Maybe it was fear finally being named. Maybe it was a father who stopped controlling and started staying. A mother who stopped defending herself from pain and chose to embrace the truth. And an invisible boy who proved that value is not born from appearance, but from the impact one leaves behind. How many times have you dismissed something because it seemed too simple? How many times have you ignored a chance because it did not come wrapped as a miracle? How many times have you chosen the familiar darkness over a light that demands courage? This story provokes because it confronts us. It asks whether you would have listened. Whether you would have tried. Or whether you too would have laughed, as so many did, before realizing that the impossible sometimes is only waiting for someone who refuses to give up. If this story touched you, leave a comment. Say what moved you the most. Say whether you would have believed or not. And if you want to keep watching stories that challenge logic, stir real emotions, and show that the impossible can change sides, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because some stories do not just pass through us. They stay. And maybe after this one you will never look at mud the same way again.